In my first video, I made the comment that the Terran, if they were a sex position, would be missionary. Very plain, very simple. I have no idea what the Zerg would be, but it would definitely have to be the craziest, wildest, most out there sex position you can think of. There may not be a more creative race in all of real-time strategy. There's just so much original here that you just gotta love it. Many hail it as the best strategic RTS race of all time just because of all the different things it brings to the table. If you play the single player of Starcraft, early on the Zerg will appear to be mindless drones that live for only one purpose: destruction. In fact, it's easy to compare them to the aliens from the Alien film franchise. One-track minds that live for nothing but destruction and reproduction. You learn in the Zerg campaign, however, that it's not quite that simple. Yes, they only live for one purpose, but that is actually to better themselves as a species, assimilate the positive qualities of any other species out there, and basically try and make themselves the dominant race. Every single Zerg obeys the orders of one Zerg, the Overmind, and is genetically incapable of disobeying. They're a nasty, filthy race that lives for only that one purpose, to serve whatever the Overmind's will may be. They have a hive mind, and they're just not a pleasant alien species. A far cry from the Protoss, which I'll be getting to shortly. So let's discuss my 5 favorite things about this race. Why it's good to be a Zerg. Number 5. How annoying they are to go up against. It's a little hard to describe, but Zerg are not going to beat people with brute force for the most part. They win by being sneaky and just really frustrating to go up against. For instance, using the power of the Zerg, you can zap your enemies with green stuff that slows their movement considerably. This is something you can do to, say, outrun them in a foot race, catch up to them, or just generally hinder their efforts to penetrate your base. There's also the Parasite ability, which allows you to see what that unit is capable of seeing if you insert the Parasite into them. This is useful for, say, scouting out an enemy base if that unit will go back to that enemy base at all. Because just as useful is the possibility of the opposing player having to sacrifice that unit. Oh yeah, and the Parasites, they're a real nice way of not only killing your enemies, but planting your units deep in enemy territory, and I'll just leave it at that. Number 4 is unit generation. This is considerably different from the Terran, the Protoss, or most other species you encounter in an RTS. Here, every unit is generated from the main base. What units you can generate is dependent on whatever other buildings you may have, but every unit in the game is generated from the little larvae that come with the main base. This is creative, it's fun, and once you get used to it, it's a real nice asset to have, because no matter how bad things get, as long as you have your main base, you can generate units that can fight. Number 3 is automatic healing. No matter how damaged a Zerg building or a Zerg unit gets, it will continue to regain health over time. This process is pretty slow, and often you find yourself waiting and waiting for something to heal, but it's still nice to know that no matter how beat up something gets, it's going to automatically regenerate health, and if you give it enough time, we'll get all the way back to full health. There's no burning here. In fact, we have the opposite effect. So that's a really nice way to rebuild your forces and buildings after they've been damaged. Number 2, we have how cheap the Zerg are. They're the cheapest of the 3 species, Terran being the middle and Protoss being the more expensive. Now there is a little bit of a trade-off here, which I'll talk about later, but it's pretty cheap to build these units. The Hydralisks in particular are very useful considering how cheap they are, costing only 75 minerals apiece and 25 Vespian gas units apiece. A lot of the units in this game can be gotten to at a fairly cheap price. Now this comes at the small expense of power, but there's another upside here that I'll talk about very shortly. But it's great to know that you can do a lot with a little when it comes to the Zerg. Number one, the advantage that cannot be denied by just about anyone and absolutely has to be considered the primary Zerg advantage: speed. This is obviously a subset of the whole Zerg rush thing. Zerg rushes are possible because you can build units so fast. No other species can generate units like the Zerg. But this is an overall thing as well. Because of the way the Zerg are constructed as a species, you can quickly build things up. You can get to the more powerful units quicker than the other species can. It's just on a whole a quick species to get to particular units, to build up your forces, and that has to be the number one advantage of the Zerg. But now we start with the cons, and number 5 on my list would have to be iffy defenses. I really don't like the Zerg turrets, and again, I don't build them unless I absolutely have to. I don't like how one particular turret can only attack the ground, and the other one can only attack the air units. It just really annoys me that I have to put in twice the work just to get an adequate defense. So, when you combine that with the fact that the units aren't great for defensive purposes, I'm just really not a huge fan here. The best thing I can say to do here is to just build a lot of hydralisks, and really that's something you'll want to do for your attacks more than your defenses. Number 4 is sacrificing drones. Every time you want to make a building of any kind, you're going to have to sacrifice a drone to do it. That drone literally becomes the building. It's not a huge deal, you can overcome it pretty easily, but if you can make a lot of buildings, you're going to have to give up a lot of drones, and it is a little frustrating at first. It's something you can adjust to, but it's one less drone you could be using for something else. Number 3, the creep, and boy can this get annoying. If you want to build any building that's not an extractor or your main base, you have to do it on the creep. You can extend the creep with your turrets, but it gets really frustrating how you have to build in a particular way just so you can get your buildings down. It's not a huge deal. Again, it's something you have to tolerate if you want to use this race, which is admittedly a good race, but it is annoying that you can't spread out your base as fast as you might want to. Number 2, weak top units. With the Terran and the Protoss, I really enjoy using the most powerful units, which is something I'll talk about a little later. But the Zerg just don't bring it. I like the Guardians, but I don't love them, and given the choice between battle cruisers, Guardians, and carriers, give me the Guardians last. They can't attack the air. It's just a little frustrating to use because as good as they can be against ground units, which, you know, they are, if you can't attack air units, eventually you're going to find yourself completely helpless. I've had to send a force of 12 Guardians running away like cowards from a single Terran shuttle. It's just a little embarrassing. And I cannot stand Ultralisks. I know they're good for what they are, but they can only attack ground units, and they have to get close to anything they can attack. They have no long-range capabilities. This really annoys me. The Ultralisks, of all the super-powered units in Starcraft, the Ultralisks have got to be my least favorite. I pretty much don't ever build them. I just do not see a use for them. Reason number 1 is pretty much universal and very obvious. You get what you pay for. The Zerg may be cheap, but they're also pretty weak. As I already said, the top units, not the strongest in Starcraft, I'd say easily the weakest. I don't think you can really overwhelm an opponent with Zerg. There are ways you can overwhelm an opponent with Terran and Protoss, but with the Zerg, I just don't see it. My favorite Zerg unit is actually the Hydralisk, which is a pretty low-level unit that is only so powerful. I just like a lot of other things about the Hydralisks. But it's really tough to overwhelm somebody with Zerg because the top units are so limited. So, it's quick, it's cheap, but it's just a little weak overall. And that has to be the number 1 Zerg complaint. And that's the Zerg for you. Again, I like them. I'm not going to say that they're better than the Terran or worse than the Terran. I'm not going to rank them at all. It's really pretty much impossible to do. They're wild, they're wacky, they're a lot of fun, they're very creative, and they have some upside. But they do have some downsides. Obviously, if they didn't, StarCraft wouldn't be so balanced. I think it's an excellent race to use for the experienced player who knows how to macro, knows how to use the queens, knows how to use all those funky little special abilities that some of the units have. But for the beginners, I'd say stay away. It's just a little too wacky. Well, now there's only one race left, and I'll probably be getting to that in my last video.